Good afternoon on today's Angry Alien Bulletin.
Okay. Okay, verify SRC, pussy, bed. What are those things going over? What is that, Jack? Hey, something just hit here.
According to NASA and the Pentagon, there is no connection between the UAP phenomenon here on Earth and any sort of extraterrestrial origin for these objects. If that is indeed the case, that means there should be no UAPs out in space. And yet, there undoubtedly are cases of UAPs having been observed both in orbit and in close proximity to the moon. Are these things for real, or are they a variety of misidentified objects and flat-out hoaxes? All of this and more coming at you on the Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to another Angry Alien Bulletin here on the Angry Astronaut. Been talking about some spaceflight-related topics over the last several days. Now it's time to get back to some of the more unconventional stuff. For example, UFOs that have been observed not here on Earth, but rather in space. This is a rabbit hole that can be very difficult and very risky to traverse. That is to say, there are so many fraudulent cases, fraudulent stories, and faked videos out there that it is very difficult indeed to find anything legitimate when it comes to UFOs that have actually been observed, and even more difficult to find any evidence of UFOs having been photographed or caught on videotape in space. And yet, these things do indeed exist. There have been a number of astronauts and cosmonauts throughout the history of the space program who claim to have observed a variety of different things. And then there are others who have been rumored to tell stories about these sorts of experiences, but then in public, they simply deny them. And even though I'm generally not inclined to subscribe to any sort of conspiracy theories when it comes to these sorts of things, I can definitely understand why an astronaut would be very, very hesitant to talk about these sorts of experiences because of what it would do to their career and to their reputation. As you're going to see here shortly, one of the men who walked on the moon is a huge believer in UFOs, who claims to have seen UFOs in space on a number of occasions. Before the time of his death, thoroughly embraced the more extreme interpretations of the UAP phenomenon, including reverse engineering programs, conspiracies within the government, the works. One of the very few people who walked on the moon really dove into this whole thing with both feet, and as a result, his reputation was utterly destroyed. People have essentially regarded him, at least the vast majority of people in the popular media and the scientific community, amongst his colleagues, etc., all of them believe that he went around the bend, that he lost his mind, and so that's why he talked about these things. And that's the only reason he talked about these sorts of things, especially as passionately as he did. And of course, this is a reputation that no astronaut wants to have. And so it would be a very, very strong incentive to keep your mouth shut if you saw anything out in space, especially if you weren't really certain about what you observed. That being the case, though, there are still very compelling examples of UFOs having been observed in space, both in orbit and in the vicinity of the moon, that in my opinion is very newsworthy. And so in the course of this video, we're going to see a whole lot of footage, some of which, in my opinion, is valid unexplained events, and then others, I think, are very obviously faked. Okay, human, today we want to do what you guys call a tick-tock. So we're gonna fly around the Endymion crater at 1:25 p.m. You'll be able to see us if you shoot right around that crater at this time of day. Otherwise, you're gonna miss us. Don't screw it up. In all seriousness, though, this is an example of just how frustrating this rabbit hole can be sometimes, because this is quite clearly faked footage. As impressive as it is, the objects are even affected by atmospherics, as they should be if they were objects that were in close proximity to the moon. It's expertly done, and it is absolutely fake. Let me try to explain why. I'm certainly not a special effects expert. However, I do like to think about things logically. Why would the observer have chosen to have a look at this particular part of the moon at this particular moment, and just by chance, that's when our aliens decided to orbit the moon? Now, that's the first observation. Number two, these are utterly colossal objects. These things are large enough to cast observable shadows, observable that is with a backyard telescope on the surface of the moon. They would have to be at least 15 to 20 kilometers in length. Something that huge would not go unnoticed by amateur astronomers around the world. There are astronomers who are observing the moon all the time, plus there are multiple nations who have satellites in orbit around the moon as well. In addition, there's an entire community of amateur astronomers who are keeping close track of anything that qualifies as a near-Earth object. These objects are much, much larger than asteroids that are routinely spotted by this community of backyard astronomers. So they would not only have noticed something like that, but also this less obvious, somewhat less blatant fake, but still definitely faked image of spacecraft or UFOs, whatever you want to call them, in operation just above the lunar surface. A tantalizing and compelling image, and undoubtedly faked. However, this one, and images like it, that is a little bit more compelling, because we're not talking about objects, visible objects in close proximity to the moon, but rather objects that happen to pass in front of the moon while under observation. This one is a lot more interesting, and I think would have been a little bit more difficult to fake, although it kind of seems to be casting a shadow, doesn't it? If that is indeed the case, this would still have to be an enormous object, at least a couple of kilometers in length. Pretty frightening stuff, if true, but once again, I've got my doubts. But while we're talking about the moon, let's put the Wayback Machine back to 1972 and Apollo 17 and listen to a rather frightening experience that Gene Cernan had involving objects that he couldn't immediately identify.
Okay. Way to go in there. It's not that big. Okay, why don't you put an SCB2 and bring that in instead? Leave SRB out, and then we'll just leave SCB2 in forever. Okay. Okay, verify SRC pussy bed. What are those things going over? What is that, Jack? Hey, something just hit here. What blue? Hey, what is that?
Now, after a rather long hesitation, Gene Cernan's partner, Harrison Schmitt, came up with an explanation. He said, "Oh, your antenna. It's that styrofoam off the high-gain antenna package." Gene Cernan still seems kind of confused. "On the LEM," he replies. "No, the one you deployed, the rover high-gain antenna. Apparently, a piece of foam packing had exploded because the sunlight was heating trapped gas bubbles. At least that's the explanation. But here's the thing. NASA actually felt it necessary to provide a more extensive explanation afterwards, saying that evidently some of the interior voids in the styrofoam were still filled with gas, despite many days of exposure to vacuum during the trip out from Earth. Alternatively, so they're not even really sure why this happened, the voids may have been filling with gases released from the foam matrix during the 6 hours or so that it had been lying out in the sunlight. In either case, solar heating has raised the pressure of trapped gases. The fact that several fragments can be seen, coupled with Gene's use of the word exploded and John Young's phrase blew up, indicates an explosive disintegration of a piece of foam. So once again, even NASA is kind of interpreting what these guys had to say rather than the astronauts themselves explaining what happened. And also later on in the broadcast, listen to this.
You just, when you saw that stuff coming, I didn't see that at all. Holy smoly. Roger 17, and John says that it blew up on his mission as well. Okay, Bob, I guess I'm going to take the TV away from you.
First of all, Gene Cernan is still very clearly shaken by that incident. You never want to see a bunch of fragments go flying over your head or around you when a single fragment that tears your suit could mean a slow, agonizing death. But at the same time, NASA comments that this had happened before. If that indeed was the case, why was Gene Cernan not briefed on this? If there's a piece of equipment on your rover that can explode in your face, wouldn't you want to know about it? It seems a little hard for me to believe that Gene Cernan had no idea that something like this might happen, that he wasn't properly briefed on something that might happen with his equipment. It seems like a gross oversight on the part of NASA to leave him so in the dark. But perhaps that happened, or perhaps they were quickly grasping at straws and trying to come up with another explanation for something they couldn't immediately explain and something that was going to be heard by the public in the future. But there is one particular astronaut who had no misconceptions about UFOs, what he claimed to have seen, and what the US government was doing with all of these things, and that is astronaut Edgar D. Mitchell, who died unfortunately in 2016, the lunar module pilot of the Apollo 14 lunar landing mission. It seems rather odd to think that one of the very few people who had an opportunity to set foot on another world would start making extreme claims about UFOs. But indeed he did. He made all the claims that David Grush is currently making and then some. He claimed that top military officials had hidden evidence of UFOs, potentially alien spacecraft, and they were particularly fond of hovering over White Sands testing range in New Mexico. The aliens, that is. According to an interview, one of the last that he gave a year before his death in 2015, quote, "White Sands was a testing ground for atomic weapons, and that's what the extraterrestrials were interested in. They wanted to know about our military capabilities. My own experience talking to people had made it clear that the ETs have been attempting to keep us from going to war and help create peace on Earth." He also said that military personnel had confided in him that alien spacecraft were responsible for disabling nuclear missiles and for shooting them down over the Pacific coast. And then he started talking publicly about even less mainstream beliefs a couple of years after landing on the moon. And by the way, he also divorced his wife at that time and founded the so-called Institute for Noetic Sciences. He used that platform to discuss exploring new worlds in ways separate from known science or religion. He became convinced that extraterrestrial life had been visiting Earth and helping humanity along a more spiritual path. He began to form his metaphysical and extraterrestrial beliefs during his training as an aviator, at least according to him, but he wasn't known as a crazy man or prone to making wild statements. If he had been known as somebody like that, he certainly would not have been able to go to the moon. And in my opinion, if you look at the full spectrum of UAP experiences from Gene Cernan on one side of the equation to Mr. Mitchell on the other side of the equation, I think this represents a microcosm of the whole UAP controversy. Either it's misinterpretation or misidentification of ordinary mundane objects, and that's what most astronauts will tell you, or there are legitimately extraterrestrial craft out there, and that's what Mr. Mitchell will tell you. And I suspect that the truth is somewhere in between. But unfortunately, the scientific community and the mainstream media would have us believe that either these objects are simply being misinterpreted or misidentified, or in cases where there is absolutely no misinterpretation involved, well, the witnesses are just plain crazy. And in my opinion, the truth is a lot more complex than that. And it's not just American astronauts who experience these sorts of strange events either. Yvonne Wagner in 2020 experienced something very odd indeed. He's known for taking some very spectacular footage of the Earth from the International Space Station. He has spent a considerable amount of time on the space station, and some of his footage is absolutely stunning. I have his Twitter page linked in the description. Anybody who's really into space should have a look at what this guy creates. It's just some amazing footage of our planet and some truly spectacular footage of the Aurora Borealis. And he happened to be filming the aurora with time-lapse photography over the South Pole when something very strange happened in the background. A grouping of objects traveling in formation, very bright and only briefly exposed to the sun, and then they suddenly vanished. They were not that easy to identify, at least not at the time, and so he sent the information to the Russian Research Institute and the Russian Academy of Sciences for further analysis. And a lot of you are probably going to think, as most of the people in the media thought at the time, that this was most likely a Starlink constellation. By the way, in my opinion, Starlink is the new swamp gas. It's the new explanation for anything unusual we see in the skies from here on out. Let me tell you why I don't think this is Starlink. Here's an example of a picture taken of the Aurora Borealis from the ISS that was messed up by Starlink. As you can see, these satellites are grouped far more closely together. They're not nearly as bright, and there's a whole lot more of them. Need more proof? Well, here's some more time exposure footage of the Aurora Borealis, this time taken from the ground, and here goes the Starlink constellation. It is a compact train of objects, and there's no reason to think that these objects were any closer or any further away from the observer than they would have been from Yvonne Wagner. They just don't look the same at all. And just to be clear, there were no other satellite constellations being launched at the time that Yvonne Wagner took that footage. Need more proof? Well, I've got even more. This time from an amateur astronomer on the ground who spotted the same grouping of lights in the sky. They look almost identical to what Yvonne Wagner filmed. And this is a little bit spooky because the astronomer then checked and double-checked his information to see if any satellites were passing overhead, a grouping of satellites that would correspond with what he observed, and there was absolutely nothing. Very interesting indeed that we have dual confirmation of the same grouping of lights in the sky, and they don't correspond to Starlink or any other type of satellite constellation that I'm familiar with. What they look a whole lot more like is the Phoenix Lights. Once again, I think that the explanation is an oversimplification, but of course, that's never going to resonate with the mainstream media or with the scientific community. Instead, it's going to be, well, if it's in the atmosphere, it's flares, gotta be flares, and if it's up in space, it's gotta be Starlink. And if that doesn't work with these people, then just make a joke about how it's not aliens, and you don't have to worry about aliens coming to kidnap your St. Bernard tomorrow night, or something like that. Our readers will get a real laugh out of that one. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Also, thank you Naked Gardener OG for becoming a Patreon subscriber right at the end of March. Really appreciate everybody joining up on Patreon to support this channel. Makes a huge difference, and if you would like to join them, all the details are in the description. Please like, please subscribe, and as always, stay angry about space.